So before we start this video, just a quick warning that I am reviewing a book that features some foreign names, and no doubt I will mispronounce them all. I apologise in advance because today I am reviewing The Navy's Here by Willi Frischauer. I did warn you. And Robert Jackson. Thank God for him. So the book was published in 1955 and promises to tell the full story of the Altmark Affair and the Battle of the River Plate, compiled from eyewitness accounts of both Germans and Britons who were involved. That said, anyone seeing these two names, and especially the German-sounding one, and expecting an equal, balanced treatment of the events, will probably be disappointed. Frischauer left Germany after clashing with the Nazis in 1935, and both he and Jackson were war correspondents for the British press. The story begins with the Altmark, a German tanker full of oil, ammunition and other supplies, dispatched into the South Atlantic in anticipation of the Second World War. When war does break out, she serves as a supply ship for the battleship Graf Spee as it raids merchant ships. What's interesting to somebody like me, who is by no means an expert but is still interested in the war, is how bloodless this all was. The Spey would approach, sometimes fire a shot or two to warn the merchant and the signal for them to surrender, which all the ships in the book did. Only one was fired on to the extent that it took any sort of significant damage. The Spey took the crew's prisoner and any goods deemed useful and then sunk the vessel. Majority of the prisoners taken by the Spey were then transferred to the Altmark when the two vessels met up for resupplying, with the novel occasionally quoting from the prisoners' own diaries to relate the circumstances on board. Eventually the Spey, which had orders not to engage military targets wherever possible, uncharacteristically attacked a group of 3 British ships. After suffering critical damage, the Spey made for the nearest port in Uruguay. The book gives quite a few details about the laws governing warships in neutral ports, and about the various tricks that the British used to try and keep the Spey in port until more ships arrived to battle her. The cleverest of these was contacting the Uruguayans and requesting shore leave for the crews of 2 aircraft carriers, which were not near enough to the area to actually be involved, but it made it seem like there was a larger naval presence waiting for the Spey when she left. And because warships are not allowed to leave port within 24 hours of a merchant, the British sent merchants into the port at intervals to keep the Spey in harbour. Unable to effect the repairs to his ship in the time allowed under the law, and expecting to face an overwhelming force when he left safe neutral water, Captain Langsdorff offloaded his remaining prisoners and scuttled the ship. These freed prisoners alerted the Navy to the presence of the Altmark and that it was carrying 300 or so prisoners. The British then start looking for the Altmark, who, after waiting some time in the South Atlantic, headed north to Iceland, then east to Norway, and then down the coast in supposedly neutral and therefore safe Norwegian water. When she's in Norwegian waters, though, she's identified by the RAF, and 3 British ships enter those Norwegian waters and force the Altmark to take refuge in a fjord. After a small delay, the ship, HMS Cossack, enters the fjord and boards the Altmark, freeing the prisoners after a firefight. Though much more interested in the heroics of the British personnel involved, Frischauer and Jackson do recount some of the political fallout from the incident. The Norwegians were naturally furious about the violation of their neutrality, and the Germans naturally protested as well, calling the British pirates among other things. The book ends then with a brief run-through of some of the principal players and their fates. There's a significant amount of intertextuality about the Navy's Here. Frischauer and Jackson quote from or refer to a number of other sources, government records of communications, the diaries of the sailors on board the Altmark, and newspaper articles, as mentioned, and as well as relaying information about the laws governing the parties involved. And although this does serve to create a documentary feel about it, it is presented as a novel. And as books go, The Navy's Here is a bit of a curiosity. None of the various military engagements involved are told in huge detail, and despite the insistence that there's heroics being performed, very little is retold in a way that much of that comes across. This is from the finale, where Captain Dow of the Altmark attempts to ram his heavier ship into HMS Cossack as it prepares to board her. The boarding party had to act quickly. By the time the Cossack was alongside the tanker's poop deck, 4 or 5 feet separated the ships, and the distance was growing every moment. "Come on," Turner shouted. "What the hell are you waiting for?" He took a great leap outwards and upwards, and officers on the bridge gave him a big cheer as he grasped the tanker's rail, steadied himself, and looked around for his men. He had drawn his revolver. Parker was over beside him, and rifles thudded to the deck as petty officers and ratings followed them. After relating that speed is of the essence, the authors present us this 25-word sentence that neither ups the ante or relates any kind of peril or stakes, while this one is actually even longer. Consider the difference here between what Frischauer and Jackson offer and the following. 4 or 5 feet of imposing black water separated the ships, but each half second took the Altmark another inch away, threatening to take her out of reach entirely. Here, what I've done is I've added the adjectives imposing and black. You could go for something like churning or the more accurate icy, but it's all there to try and make that gap threatening. This is, after all, the water that claims at least 2 lives, either through drowning or hypothermia, so it's worth including just how dangerous the situation is. Then with half a second an inch, it's a trade-off. We don't want to play down the scale of these 2 huge ships coming together, but we do want to suggest that the line between success and failure is minute. Then with threatening again, we're just building the danger of the situation. The scene in the novel continues as follows. Most of the first small group were across and ready for action when Turner saw Atkins hanging on to one of the lower guardrails. Unable to take a run, he had failed to grasp the Altmark's top rail when he jumped, and was trying desperately to get his footing as he swung. I think you can improve this just immediately by moving the word desperately from here to here. Most of the first small group were across and ready for action when Turner saw Atkins desperately hanging on to one of the lower guardrails. You can do a lot more with it still, but I don't intend to rewrite the whole book. My point is simply that the authors could do more with their material, which we can actually see by examining contemporary sources, probably the very sources that Frischauer and Jackson were drawing on themselves. This is from an article in the Daily Mail when it reported the events. I won't read it all, but just this section where there is 2 short bursts of activity, both characterised by language of haste and determination. Swift orders were snapped out. Blue jackets seized grappling irons. Consider also the use of grappling irons here. It foreshadows that this battle will be characterised by struggling man against man at close quarters, even before the line where the bayonets are fixed. Little wonder there was, for a while, the notion spread that some of the sailors fought in the battle using cutlasses. This later passage has some of the language I was talking about earlier, crashing, looming, darkness, while this third does something again that emphasises the confines of this battlefield, and the last one here shows the stakes and the perils involved. It's surprising really to find a newspaper presenting a more entertaining take on something than a novel based on it. I actually attribute this more to Frischauer and Jackson's version attempting to sit somewhat closer to the truth than the wartime press did. However, while their writing never really gets the heart racing, the Navy's here is fascinating. Even the sections where the authors relate some of the intricacies of maritime law and the back and forth of communiques between embassies is handled with enough alacrity that it never feels like an exposition dump. There's a huge amount of characters involved, as you'd imagine, sometimes so many that remembering who is only possible due to a little reminder from the authors about which job they held on which ship before imprisonment on the Altmark. In fact, the 2 characters I think are explored the most are probably the 2 German captains, Langdorf and Dow, the latter being the archetype of moustache twiddling petty Nazi, while Langdorf is, by contrast, an honourable gentleman sailor with no love for the Nazi party. Whether any of that side of things is true or fair is not really for me to judge, but Dow was vilified for his treatment of the prisoners in the British press, while most of the accounts from those prisoners, even the ones related in this book, say that they were not significantly mistreated. Conditions were undoubtedly grim, but then the Altmark was never designed or expected to transport prisoners. The intricacies of the international situation is very interesting as well. The Uruguayans, where the Spey docked, were neutral but favoured the Allies due in part to British investment in the region. If Langsdorff could have put in Argentina, he may have found himself in a more favourable situation, with their government leaning towards the German side. Likewise, the Norwegians are really between a rock and a hard place. This plays out through the behaviour of their patrols, who stopped the Altmark 3 times, slowing her movements through the Norwegian waters. When Dow protests that English ships are in their water illegally, one replies, "Just like your U-boats," and no doubt there would have been a good deal of Norwegians unhappy with the German torpedoing and bombing of their merchant ships in the North Sea. After the 3rd Norwegian intervention, Captain Dow protests that the delays mean he will not make the Skagerrak tonight and will likely run into the Royal Navy tomorrow. The Norwegian captain tells him, "Tonight, tomorrow night, I do not think it makes much difference." And there is definitely a sense that the Norwegians are deliberately delaying the Altmark, yet they are still keen to avoid a firefight in their own territory. as the patrol boat also prevents the British ships from closing the border until the Cossack forces the issue in the fjord. The Grafspee sank its first victim, the Clement, on the 30th of September 1939. It fought at the River Plate in mid-December and was scuttled shortly afterwards, while the Altmark was not attacked in the fjord until the following February. You might expect from these dates that the pace for this novel would be unbalanced, especially with Frischauer and Jackson trying to be relatively faithful to events, but instead the novel actually feels like it's building towards a climax. That climax, as we've explored, it disappoints a touch if I'm being honest, but it does draw you in effectively, even if the outcome is known ahead of time. The finale, though, is just a little bit disappointing in that its big moment, the immortal line connected indelibly with the Altmark Affair and the book's own title, it's a little fluffed. With the firefight over, the rescuers look through the ship for the prisoners. They open the hold and shout, "Any British in here?" And there's a reply in the affirmative, "We're all British." The rescuer says, "Coming up then, the Navy's here." I really like it. It almost speaks of a nonchalance, like months of effort from hundreds of people amounted to what was just another day at work. Except this version of the exchange is from the paratext and is not the one that Frischauer and Jackson use in their novel. Instead they use this, "Come up, the Navy's here." It may not feel like much of a distinction, but it doesn't quite have the same effect. It feels a little bit like fluffing the big line. "Frankly, madame, I don't give a dear." In the days after the Altmark incident, both the British and the German propagandists attempted to use it to their advantage. So, despite their diligence in speaking to the participants, Frischauer and Jackson wouldn't have had a great deal of unbiased sources to deal with. They side firmly with the British view, though in a far less obvious and bombastic way than the contemporary efforts of the Daily Mail. Viewed as entertainment, the Navy's here could use a little bombast. As a documentary, it wears its colours firmly on its sleeve and would likely have been of use to a later generation of propagandists as the British Empire neared its collapse. It would have been interesting to see this retold from the likes of somebody like Alistair MacLean, who no doubt would have served the heroics better, but it's still an interesting look at a fascinating piece of history involving a handful of nations. I have no hesitation in recommending this book to anyone interested in the war generally, but definitely to anyone interested in the Grafspee or the Altmark Affair. The only real downside to it is that my old and pre-loved copy has not stood up too well to the rigours of being read. I'll have to get another one. Maybe I'll see you in the bookshop when all the beer bug has run its course. Until then, stay safe and look after each other.